It's 11 o'clock and I'm about ready to start. Hello? Can you hear me in the back? Can you hear me there? Okay, great. Is the sound okay?
Yes.
Okay, I'm ready to begin. The topic that I've been assigned for this period, let me read it off to you. It is an Austrian critique of mainstream economics. So I'm going to be talking about an Austrian critique of mainstream economists. I would say if we had a Venn diagram, and here is Austrian economics, and here is, call it the mainstream or the neoclassical economists, that there is an overlap. We Austrians have certain views that are unique to us. They have certain views that are unique to them, and then there's this overlap in between the two. And I'll be mainly speaking of this part where we disagree with them, but let me first say that there are areas of agreement. For example, most economists, whether Austrian or mainstream, favor free trade. Most economists, whether mainstream or Austrian, think that the minimum wage law will create unemployment for unskilled workers. Think that rent control will take resources away from residential rental units and make it worse for tenants. So there is an overlap, a great overlap. There's even an overlap in terms of econometrics. Some people, radical Austrians, not me, I'm a moderate, that's why they call me Walter Moderate Block. Jeff Herbener on this one is an extremist. He says that there's no use in Austrian economics for statistics or econometrics. And in my view, if what you're interested in is an empirical issue, well then why not? For example, the elasticity of shoes. We know that there's a downward sloping demand curve for shoes. And if we raise the price of shoes by 10%, we know that fewer shoes will be purchased. But how many fewer? 1%, 2%, 20%, what? What's the elasticity of the demand curve for shoes? And we Austrians really have no dog in that fight. We're happy to go along with the mainstream people and say, well, if you want to find that out, the way to do it is through econometrics or statistics or mathematical economics. There's nothing wrong with that. So we're not against math per se, period, but we do have great reservations about it because a lot of math and economics, it assumes smooth curves, because if you want to get, a slope of a curve, you can only, whatever it is, say price and quantity, and that's, say, some sort of demand curve, and you want to pick the slope of it, you have to take the slope. And you can only get a slope if the curve is continuous. And if you want to differentiate or integrate a curve, it has to be a continuous curve. But we Austrians believe that there is no smooth curves out there or that depict reality, because economics discusses human action, and human action is discrete. So you don't get curves like that, you get some sort of jagged lines in that regard, and therefore we have great suspicion of it. For example, let me give you an example of that. Here is an average cost curve, and average cost curve, quantity, price, and the mainstream think that the best place to be is at the bottom of the average cost curve. And if you have a downward sloping demand curve, which means you're not in perfect competition, well then the demand curve has got to be tangent to the average cost curve at an inefficient point. Everyone following this? Okay. But Murray Rothbard in his Man, Economy, and State says, look, this whole thing depends upon smooth curves. And what you're doing is you're letting the mathematical tail wag the economics dog, whereas it should be the opposite. the economics is more important. The math is just a handmaiden of the economics for economists. For mathematicians, fine, let the math, math uber alles for mathematicians, but not for us. So what Murray does is he draws the curve like this, and then he says, look, here's an average cost curve, there's quantity, there's price, and we can be at the bottom of the average cost curve even with a downward sloping demand curve. And the whole reason that you're not is because of a smooth curved assumption. So that's sort of completely backwards. So that would be just one example of math and economics where we Austrians disagree with the mainstream people. Those of you who are going to graduate school in economics, especially in the US, not so much in Europe where they're more Austrian, but in the US, it's mainly math. I had some graduate student or a student who graduated from Loyola, went off to graduate school and took one look at the micro text, and it was all math, and she didn't want to do math for 5 years, so she quit. I wonder about that, but that's a whole other story. Okay, so that's one area where we disagree, and here I would say that getting back to this diagram, I'm going to be going over many, many areas where the Austrians disagree with the mainstream, and I'm going to take the Austrian point of view. I'm an Austrian economist, and I'll be taking the Austrian point against the mainstream. Okay, I've got about 15 things like this on my list. I don't know how far I'll get through, but I'll just keep pushing until we come to the end of the period. Okay, another one is this thing called the synthetic a priori. What's the synthetic a priori? A synthetic a priori statement is a statement that's apodictically necessarily true and yet has something to do with the real world. And this is one of the sticking points for me when I first was introduced to Austrian economics. I was introduced to it by Murray Rothbard just when I was finishing up my PhD at Columbia, which was a logical positivist kind of a place, a mainstream place if ever there was one. My main mentor was Gary Becker, Nobel Prize winner, and I was a logical positivist, and I couldn't understand how that could possibly be. It seemed like magical, it seemed cultish, it seemed weird, it seemed ridiculous that there were actual statements that have to do with the real world, and yet we know them absolutely for sure, and we don't have to test them. We know them just by the logic of them. The way the mainstream sees this is there are two kinds of things, and the two shall never meet. One is analytic or tautology or a priori. 2 + 2 is 4, the Pythagorean theorem, all bachelors are unmarried men, things like that, which are necessarily true, but they don't impact the world. They're more how we use language, that sort of a thing. And on the other hand, there are empirical statements that do impact the world and do describe the world and do explain the world and help us understand the world. For example, it's sunny outside, or it's nice and cool in here, but it's very hot outside, or there are about 50 people in the room. These are empirical statements which are not necessarily true. You have to test them. To go out and look and see if they're right, and they have to be falsifiable. We have to know what it would mean for them not to be true. And never the twain shall meet, so that there are analytic statements that are necessarily true that don't impact the world, and then there are empirical statements, a posteriori statements that do impact the world, that do describe the world, that help us understand and explain the world, but we have to test them. And where do you get a statement that has both? Well, we Austrians, not me originally, but Murray Rothbard, Hans Hoppe, other Austrians, have come up with a series of them. For example, if I trade you this pen for my watch, it must mean that I value the pen more than the watch, at least in anticipations right now, and it must mean that you value the pen more than the watch more than the pen. Necessarily true. Why else would you do the trade? Now, you might think that if you make the trade, I'll give you an A in the course. Who knows? Or you might think if you make the trade, I'll be your best friend. I don't know why you're doing it. All I know is there's something about this watch you like more than pen because you're giving up the pen to get the watch. And there's something about this pen that I like more than the watch, otherwise I wouldn't give it up. This is necessarily true. I got into a big debate with, what was his name from George Mason, the guy that wrote about the irrationality of democracy. Brian Kaplan got into a big debate on this, and he wouldn't even concede that this is necessarily true. He kept coming up, well, maybe people are lying or something like that. It's hard to deal with these people. I used to be one, so I can sort of understand. But they're fixed. It can't be. And now I'm going to read off a whole bunch of other statements that are synthetic a priori. And I say that this distinguishes Austrians from the mainstream because they don't cotton to this. They think it's cultish, it's religious, and they dismiss us as religious cultists. Okay, so one is the gain from trade, the opposite ranking of two goods. There's a tendency for profits to be zero. A tendency. Whenever you say there's a tendency, you can't falsify it. You can't falsify it. Because I say there's a tendency for profits to fall to zero, and right now profits aren't zero. Some are positive, some are negative, some are zero. Well, that doesn't refute the fact that there's a tendency, and yet we know there's a tendency. And there's also a tendency for profits in all industries to be the same zero, but at least the same. Because if they're high here and low here, the resources will flow out of here and into here, pushing down the profits here and pushing up the profits there until you get some sort of equilibration. There's a tendency for markets to equilibrate. We never reach equilibrium or the evenly rotating economy, but there's a tendency for it. Others are law of marginal utility. Whenever the supply of a good increases by 1 unit, provided each unit is regarded of equal serviceability by a person, the value attached to the unit must decrease, diminishing marginal utility. Another one is the Ricardian law of association, comparative advantage. Whenever minimum wage laws are enforced that require wages to be higher than existing market wages, involuntary unemployment will result. Whenever the quantity of money is increased while the demand for money is unchanged, the purchasing power of money will fall. So Austrian economics is littered with synthetic a priori statements. Statements that are necessarily true and yet impact on the real world. The Austrian business cycle theory is a synthetic a priori statement. It's a much bigger statement. It takes a lot of premises to get it out, and I'll talk a little bit about it, but that's another one. So these are a priori, unfalsifiable, and people like Krugman will say, well, if it's unfalsifiable, it's magic. So this is a crucial distinction between the two. Okay, another one is this thing about testability. Let me tell you a little story about my dissertation with Gary Becker. And my dissertation was roughly of the sort that, well, all econometric equations are of the sort A equals y equals a plus b1x plus b2 x2 plus b3 x3 plus an error term. And what I was trying to do is, here was my rent control variable. And what I said is that the more rent control, the lousier the housing would be. Holding constant, what else do I have to hold constant? Well, wealth, I have to hold constant. Anything else that might impact the quality of housing, such as weather. You know, if it's very bad weather, you'll have lousier housing than otherwise. And here was, say, good housing. And what I expected was that this thing would be negative. Namely, there'd be a negative relationship between more rent control and less housing quality, holding everything else constant. That was my dissertation, roughly. There was a lot more, but that was one of the points. And most of the time, I got the right sign. And most of the time, thank God, it was statistically significant at the